I'm Natalie, 27 years old, and last Tuesday was supposed to be the day I finally paid the remaining balance for my dream wedding venue. Instead, I discovered that my parents had drained the wedding fund they'd promised me since I was 16. Every single dollar, gone without a word. What they didn't expect was that I'd been helping manage their company's finances for the past 2 years, and I had legitimate access to freeze their main business account. Nobody imagined that protecting my wedding would lead to shutting down Riverside Construction's payroll, but when someone steals your future, expect consequences. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because understanding my family is crucial to understanding why what happened next was both inevitable and completely justified. Growing up as the youngest daughter of Patricia and Benjamin Holloway in the picturesque town of Millbrook Springs meant living in a house where appearances mattered more than authenticity. From the outside, we were the perfect American success story. Dad built Riverside Construction from nothing into the largest contracting company in 3 counties, specializing in luxury homes and commercial developments. Mom managed the company's administrative side while maintaining her image as the town's premier hostess, organizing charity galas and sitting on the hospital board. Our colonial-style house on Magnolia Drive was featured in the local lifestyle magazine twice, complete with professionally staged photos of our close-knit family gathered around the marble kitchen island. What those photos didn't capture was the suffocating control that governed every aspect of my existence, disguised as parental guidance and wrapped in the rhetoric of building character. The wedding fund was established when I turned 16. During one of those family meetings, Dad insisted on holding every few months. "Natalie," he announced, sliding a manila folder across the mahogany dining table, "your mother and I believe every young woman deserves her dream wedding. We're setting aside money each month so that when the time comes, you'll have everything you need for a celebration worthy of the Holloway name." The initial deposit was $15,000, with monthly contributions that would bring the total to $60,000 by my 25th birthday. It seemed generous, even loving, until Dad outlined the conditions. The money would be held in a joint account with both parents as primary holders and me as a beneficiary. Any withdrawals required both of their signatures. The funds could only be used for wedding expenses they deemed, quote, appropriate and reflective of our family's standing in the community. At 16, those conditions seemed reasonable. I was grateful for parents who thought ahead, who wanted to give me the wedding of my dreams. I didn't recognize the invisible leash they were crafting, designed to ensure that even my most personal choices would remain under their control. Throughout college at Rosewood University, where I studied business administration at Dad's insistence, the wedding fund grew steadily. Every few months, Mom would update me on the balance, often mentioning how the money could be put to better use if I chose a more practical path in life. When I brought home boyfriends she disapproved of, she would casually mention how unfortunate it would be to, quote, waste such a substantial wedding fund on someone who couldn't appreciate what we've built. The psychological manipulation was subtle but constant. The fund wasn't just money. It was leverage, a way to influence my choices about career, education, and most importantly, whom I would marry. Every relationship I pursued was evaluated not just on my happiness, but on whether my potential partner met the Holloway family standards for respectability and social status. After graduation, I joined Riverside Construction as the office manager, a position Dad created specifically for me. The salary was generous, the work was manageable, and it kept me close to home where my parents could monitor my choices. More importantly, it gave me legitimate access to the company's financial systems, a detail that would prove crucial years later. Working alongside Dad taught me the construction business inside and out, but it also revealed the extent of his need for control. Every decision, from vendor relationships to employee schedules, had to meet his approval. He treated the business like his personal kingdom, and by extension, he treated everyone in it, including family, as subjects rather than partners. When I met David Martinelli at a regional business conference in Cedar Falls, I knew immediately that he represented everything my parents feared: independence from their influence. David was a civil engineer who ran his own consulting firm, specializing in sustainable construction practices. He was intelligent, ambitious, and, most threateningly to my parents, completely self-sufficient. He didn't need their connections, their money, or their approval to build a successful life. Our courtship was intense and genuine, built on shared professional interests and a mutual desire to create something meaningful together. When David proposed after 18 months of dating, he did so with a vintage Art Deco ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a choice that reflected thoughtfulness rather than expense, sentiment rather than status. The engagement announcement dinner at Chez Laurent, Millbrook Springs' most exclusive restaurant, was a disaster masked as a celebration. Mom spent the evening asking David pointed questions about his 5-year financial projections and long-term growth strategies. Dad interrogated him about his client base, his business insurance, and his retirement planning, treating the conversation like a hostile merger negotiation rather than a family dinner. But they didn't object outright. Instead, they smiled tightly and offered congratulations that felt more like condolences. They promised full access to the wedding fund, emphasizing how generous they were being and how grateful I should feel for their continued support. I should have recognized those words for the warning they were. In my family, generosity always came with invisible strings, and support was another word for control. The trap was set. I just didn't see it coming until it was too late. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how my parents could justify stealing my wedding fund, you need to understand the world they built around themselves, and how I fit into their carefully constructed empire. Benjamin Holloway didn't just run Riverside Construction, he ruled it like a feudal lord overseeing his domain. The company headquarters occupied a sprawling complex on Industrial Boulevard, complete with executive offices that resembled a luxury hotel lobby more than a construction firm. Dad's corner office featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Millbrook River, leather furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and walls lined with awards from the Chamber of Commerce and Better Business Bureau. But the real power center of Riverside Construction wasn't Dad's impressive office. It was Mom's domain in the administrative wing. Patricia Holloway had transformed what should have been simple bookkeeping into a sophisticated operation that controlled every financial aspect of the business. She managed payroll for over 200 employees, handled vendor relationships worth millions annually, and maintained the complex web of accounts that kept multiple construction projects funded simultaneously. Mom's office was smaller than Dad's, but arguably more important. 3 computer monitors displayed real-time financial data, cash flow projections, employee time tracking, vendor payment schedules, and the dozen different accounts that money flowed through daily. She could tell you within minutes exactly how much money was in each account, which checks were pending, and whether any project was running over budget. This level of financial control extended far beyond the business. Mom managed every aspect of our family's money with the same obsessive attention to detail. Our household budget was tracked in color-coded spreadsheets. Every expense over $50 required justification. Even my college textbook purchases were scrutinized and filed under educational investments, with detailed notes about their necessity. The Holloway family operated on a simple philosophy: money equals control, and control equals security. Every financial decision, from business purchases to family vacations, was evaluated not just on cost, but on how it reflected our status in Millbrook Springs' social hierarchy. We didn't just live in the most expensive neighborhood, we lived in the house that made a statement about our success. We didn't just drive luxury cars, we drove the specific models that conveyed the right image to clients and competitors. This obsession with appearances shaped every family interaction. Sunday dinners weren't casual family time. They were strategy sessions where Dad discussed upcoming projects. Mom reported on the week's financial performance, and I was expected to contribute insights about office efficiency and employee morale. My older brother Cameron had escaped this dynamic by moving to Portland after college, but I had been drawn back into the family orbit through a combination of financial incentives and emotional manipulation. Working at Riverside Construction meant witnessing the full scope of my parents' need for control. They didn't just manage employees, they managed every aspect of those employees' lives they could influence. Health insurance was provided through a company Dad personally selected. The annual Christmas party wasn't a celebration, it was a carefully orchestrated display of company success and family values. Even casual conversations were monitored for signs of discontent or disloyalty. The wedding fund represented the pinnacle of this control strategy. By positioning themselves as generous parents investing in my future happiness, they had created a financial incentive for me to make choices they approved of. Every relationship I pursued was evaluated against the implicit question, is this person worthy of our $60,000 investment? When college friends visited Millbrook Springs, they were always impressed by our house, our cars, and the apparent closeness of our family. What they didn't see was the suffocating weight of expectations that came with every privilege. The beautiful bedroom I'd grown up in came with the understanding that I would maintain perfect grades. The car they bought me for graduation came with GPS tracking and monthly mileage reviews. The job at Riverside Construction came with the expectation that I would eventually take over Mom's administrative role and marry someone who could contribute to the family business. David represented everything my parents feared, a successful man who didn't need their money, their connections, or their approval. His engineering firm, Martinelli and Associates, specialized in environmentally sustainable construction practices, an approach that Dad viewed as expensive idealism rather than sound business practice. Worse, David had strong opinions about construction ethics and worker treatment that directly contradicted some of Riverside Construction's more profit-focused policies. During our engagement dinner at Chez Laurent, the tension wasn't just about David personally, it was about what our marriage would represent. A son-in-law who couldn't be controlled financially was a son-in-law who might influence me to question the family business practices I'd grown up accepting as normal. Mom's questions about David's financial projections weren't really about his business success. They were intelligence gathering, an attempt to find leverage points that could be used later. Dad's interrogation about insurance and retirement planning was really about determining whether David would ever need financial assistance that could come with strings attached. What my parents didn't realize was that working in their company had taught me more than just office management. 3 years of processing payroll, managing vendor payments, and reconciling accounts had given me an intimate understanding of how money moved through Riverside Construction. I knew which accounts funded which projects, which payments were scheduled for which dates, and most importantly, I knew the passwords and authorization codes for almost every financial system the company used. This knowledge had accumulated gradually, naturally, as Mom trained me to be her eventual replacement. She had given me increasing levels of access to financial systems, teaching me to process emergency payments when she was traveling and handle routine transactions during busy periods. What felt like professional development was actually the foundation for the leverage I would later need. But in those early days of my engagement, I was still operating from a place of hope rather than suspicion. I believed that despite their obvious disapproval of David, my parents would ultimately support my happiness. The wedding fund represented their commitment to my future, and I trusted that commitment despite the warning signs I was beginning to notice. The engagement period should have been a time of joy and planning. Instead, it became a careful dance around my parents' expectations, a constant negotiation between what I wanted and what they deemed acceptable. Every conversation about wedding plans included subtle reminders of who was funding the celebration and what that funding entitled them to expect. I didn't realize that while I was planning a wedding, my parents were planning something else entirely. The pattern of control that governed my life began so early and so gradually that I mistook it for normal parental involvement. Looking back, I can see how methodically my parents shaped every aspect of my development to ensure I would never develop the independence to challenge their authority. Elementary school was when the foundation was laid. While other children chose their own extracurricular activities based on interest or friendship groups, my schedule was carefully curated by Mom to build essential life skills. Piano lessons weren't about musical enjoyment. They were about discipline and performing for guests at dinner parties. Ballet classes weren't about creative expression. They were about posture and grace that would serve me well in social situations. Even my friendships were monitored and subtly influenced through playdates with children whose parents moved in the right social circles. The control extended to seemingly minor details that collectively created an environment where questioning wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. My bedroom was redecorated every few years, but always according to Mom's vision of what was age-appropriate and tasteful. My clothing was purchased during supervised shopping trips where my preferences were noted and then gently redirected toward choices that complemented my natural features and reflected good judgment. Summer breaks became intensive training programs disguised as enriching experiences. While classmates attended regular camps or spent lazy weeks at home, I was enrolled in leadership seminars for young entrepreneurs, etiquette courses at the country club, and academic programs designed to keep me ahead of my peers. Each program was positioned as an investment in my future, a way to ensure I would have every possible advantage in life. The messaging was consistent and insidious. My parents knew best because they loved me most. Their choices for me were superior to any choices I might make for myself, because they had experience, wisdom, and resources I lacked. Independence wasn't presented as a natural part of growing up. It was presented as dangerous, something that could lead to poor decisions and wasted opportunities. High school brought more sophisticated forms of control. My course schedule was planned 2 years in advance, with every elective chosen to enhance my college applications rather than explore my interests. When I expressed curiosity about art classes, Dad explained that creative pursuits were wonderful hobbies, but wouldn't contribute to a practical career. When I wanted to join the debate team, Mom suggested student government instead because leadership experience looks better to admissions committees. Dating was perhaps the most tightly controlled aspect of my teenage years, though the control was exercised with surgical precision to avoid appearing unreasonable. Boys were never explicitly forbidden, but somehow every relationship I developed faced invisible obstacles. The boy I liked sophomore year suddenly stopped calling after Dad mentioned his father's unfortunate business difficulties during a casual conversation. The sweet junior I dated briefly found himself excluded from group invitations and family events until the relationship naturally faded from lack of social support. College selection followed the same pattern of manufactured choice. I was encouraged to research schools and express preferences, but the final list of applications mysteriously aligned with institutions that offered strong business programs and maintained prestigious reputations. Rosewood University wasn't my first choice, but it was positioned as the obvious choice, close enough to home for regular visits, expensive enough to demonstrate our family's success, and academically rigorous enough to ensure I would graduate with credentials that reflected well on the Holloway name. Even my dormitory experience was managed from a distance. Mom called every Sunday to discuss my classes, my social activities, and my spending habits. Care packages arrived regularly, always containing items I hadn't requested but that Mom thought I needed. When I mentioned struggling with a particular professor, Dad somehow arranged for me to be transferred to a different section, taught by someone with connections to Riverside Construction. The summer internships that other students had to compete for were effortlessly arranged through Dad's business network. I worked at a downtown law firm where the senior partner played golf with Dad, then at an accounting office where Mom served on the charity board with the owner's wife. These positions provided excellent resume material and professional references, but they also ensured that my summers were spent under the supervision of family friends who reported back on my performance and attitude. My major in business administration wasn't really my choice, though it was presented as a logical decision based on my natural aptitude for organization and leadership. When I mentioned interest in psychology or education, those subjects were repositioned as potential minors or graduate school considerations, something to explore after establishing a solid foundation in practical skills. The truly brilliant aspect of my parents' control system was how they made me complicit in my own limitation. Every restriction was framed as an opportunity, every intervention was positioned as support, and every major decision was presented as a collaboration where my input was valued and considered. I genuinely believed I was making my own choices, even as those choices were systematically narrowed to options my parents could accept. Financial dependency was the invisible chain that made everything else possible. My college tuition, living expenses, car, and incidentals were all provided generously and without complaint. The implicit message was clear. As long as I remained grateful and compliant, financial security was guaranteed. The unspoken corollary was equally clear. Independence would mean giving up not just money, but the entire lifestyle and social position I had grown up taking for granted. Working at Riverside Construction after graduation felt like a natural transition rather than a deliberate trap. The salary was competitive, the work environment was familiar, and the job responsibilities played to my strengths in organization and communication. Mom positioned my hiring as temporary, a way to gain business experience before deciding on my long-term career path. But temporary stretched into permanent as the months passed. The work itself was engaging enough to prevent boredom, and the family dynamic made leaving feel like betrayal rather than normal career progression. Every few months, Mom would mention how much she valued having me in the office, how smoothly operations ran with my assistants, and how proud she was of my professional development. The wedding fund served as the ultimate expression of this control system. By establishing it early and emphasizing the sacrifice it represented, my parents created a financial incentive that influenced every relationship decision I made for over a decade. The fund wasn't just money. It was a promise of security, a symbol of their love, and a tool for ensuring that even my most intimate choices aligned with their vision for my future. When David entered my life, he represented the first genuine threat to this carefully constructed system of control, not because he was rebellious or disrespectful, but because he offered something my parents couldn't provide: authentic partnership based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The engagement period would reveal just how far they were willing to go to maintain their influence over my life. The Millbrook Springs Business Expo was supposed to be a routine networking event, the kind of professional obligation I attended twice a year to represent Riverside Construction and make polite conversation with potential clients. I had no idea that walking into the Cedar Falls Convention Center that rainy October morning would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my carefully planned life. David Martinelli was presenting a workshop on sustainable construction practices, a topic that most traditional contractors in our area viewed with skepticism. While Dad and his peers saw environmental considerations as expensive complications that ate into profit margins, David was demonstrating how green building techniques could actually reduce long-term costs while creating healthier, more efficient structures. I found myself genuinely captivated by his presentation, not just because the content challenged everything I'd been taught about construction priorities, but because David spoke with an authenticity I rarely encountered in my professional circles. He wasn't performing or posturing. He was sharing genuine expertise with the passion of someone who truly believed in his work's value. During the coffee break, I approached him with what I intended to be a polite professional inquiry about incorporating some of his techniques into Riverside Construction projects. What began as a 5-minute conversation stretched into an hour-long discussion that covered everything from building materials to business philosophy to our shared frustration with the construction industry's resistance to innovation. David was unlike anyone I'd encountered in Millbrook Springs' social and professional circles. He asked thoughtful questions about my role at Riverside Construction and listened carefully to my responses, treating my opinions as valuable rather than automatically deferring to my family's reputation. When I mentioned some inefficiencies I'd noticed in our current project management systems, he offered practical suggestions without trying to sell me anything or position himself as superior. Most remarkably, David seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences as an individual, rather than as Benjamin Holloway's daughter or Riverside Construction's office manager. For the first time in years, I found myself in a conversation where my value wasn't derived from my family connections or financial background. We exchanged business cards that day, and David followed up within a week with information about a sustainable building conference in the state capitol. He thought some of the sessions might be relevant to Riverside Construction's future planning, and he wondered if I might be interested in attending. The invitation was professional but personal, suggesting lunch between conference sessions to continue our discussion about industry innovations. The conference trip became my first real taste of intellectual independence. Away from Millbrook Springs and the subtle monitoring that characterized my daily life, I experienced what it felt like to engage with ideas purely on their merit, rather than through the filter of family expectations. David introduced me to other professionals who were pioneering new approaches to construction, and for 3 days I participated in conversations about creativity, innovation, and social responsibility. More importantly, I began to see my work at Riverside Construction from a completely different perspective. The efficiency improvements I'd been implementing weren't just administrative adjustments. They were meaningful contributions to project success. The cost-saving measures I'd identified represented genuine business insights, rather than dutiful completion of assigned tasks. For the first time, I started to view myself as a professional with valuable skills, rather than simply a family member fulfilling expected obligations. David and I began meeting regularly for coffee or lunch, ostensibly to discuss potential collaboration between our companies, but increasingly to explore ideas that neither of us could fully develop within our respective professional environments. He was working on proposals for municipal projects that could benefit from Riverside Construction's infrastructure capabilities, while I was identifying ways our company could differentiate itself through more environmentally conscious practices. These conversations revealed fundamental differences between David's approach to business and the philosophy I'd grown up accepting as normal. David viewed his work as problem-solving that benefited communities, while Riverside Construction focused primarily on maximizing profit margins. David emphasized collaboration and mutual benefit in client relationships, while my family's approach prioritized maintaining leverage and control. David operated from a position of professional confidence based on expertise and ethical practices, while my parents relied heavily on social connections and financial intimidation. The relationship that developed between us felt revolutionary precisely because it was based on genuine compatibility rather than strategic calculation. David wasn't trying to gain access to my family's wealth or business connections. His own firm was successful enough to make such considerations irrelevant. He wasn't impressed by the Holloway family's social status, or intimidated by my parents' reputation for demanding perfection from everyone in their orbit. Instead, David seemed to appreciate qualities in me that my family had always taken for granted or actively discouraged. He valued my analytical thinking and problem-solving abilities rather than just my organizational skills. He encouraged me to express opinions and challenge assumptions rather than simply implementing other people's decisions. Most surprisingly, he found my questions and curiosity engaging, rather than inconvenient or presumptuous. Our first official date was dinner at a small restaurant in Cedar Falls, far enough from Millbrook Springs to avoid the inevitable social scrutiny that would accompany being seen together locally. The conversation flowed naturally from professional topics to personal histories, and I found myself sharing thoughts and experiences I'd never articulated to anyone. David told me about growing up in a family where disagreement was viewed as healthy intellectual exercise rather than disrespectful rebellion. His parents had encouraged him to question their assumptions, explore different perspectives, and make his own mistakes as part of normal development. The contrast with my own upbringing was stark and illuminating. When David described his decision to start his own firm rather than join an established company, he spoke about autonomy and creative freedom in ways that made me realize how constrained my own professional choices had been. His enthusiasm for solving complex engineering challenges made me recognize that I'd never been encouraged to pursue work that genuinely excited me rather than simply fulfilled family expectations. The 8 months of dating that followed were a gradual awakening to possibilities I'd never seriously considered. David introduced me to friends who were pursuing diverse careers based on passion rather than prestige, who made decisions based on personal values rather than family approval, and who viewed romantic relationships as partnerships between equals rather than strategic alliances between families. Through David's eyes, I began to see my parents' behavior patterns more clearly. The constant monitoring wasn't protective, it was controlling. The generous financial support wasn't unconditional love. It was a system for ensuring compliance. The emphasis on family loyalty wasn't about genuine connection. It was about maintaining hierarchy and preventing independent thinking. When David proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the Millbrook River, using his grandmother's Art Deco ring rather than purchasing something expensive and contemporary, the gesture represented everything my parents would struggle to understand: thoughtfulness over extravagance, sentiment over status, and genuine commitment over strategic calculation. I said yes immediately, not just because I loved David, but because marrying him represented choosing authenticity over performance, partnership over dependency, and my own values over inherited expectations. The engagement ring on my finger became a symbol of possibility and independence that my parents would spend the next several months trying to undermine. The engagement announcement dinner at Chez Laurent was my first real glimpse into the sophisticated warfare my parents could wage when their control was threatened. What I had naively hoped would be a celebration became a carefully orchestrated interrogation designed to expose David's inadequacies and remind me of everything I would be giving up by choosing him over their vision for my future. Mom spent 2 weeks planning the dinner with the precision of a military campaign. The restaurant was chosen not for its cuisine, but for its exclusivity, a place where being seen meant something to Millbrook Springs' social elite. The guest list was deliberately small, just my parents, David, and me, ensuring that every word would be heard and analyzed without outside witnesses to moderate the conversation. The evening began with Dad's seemingly casual questions about David's business trajectory. "Engineering consulting is fascinating," he said, swirling his wine with practiced sophistication. "Tell me about your growth projections for the next 5 years. Are you planning to expand your team, take on larger contracts, maybe diversify into related services?" What sounded like polite professional interest was actually a systematic evaluation of David's earning potential and business stability. Every answer was mentally cataloged and compared against the financial security that Riverside Construction could provide. When David mentioned his preference for maintaining a smaller, specialized firm rather than pursuing aggressive expansion, I watched Dad's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. Mom's approach was more subtle but equally calculated. She peppered David with questions about his family background, education, and personal interests, gathering intelligence that could be used to identify potential weaknesses or incompatibilities. When David mentioned that his parents still lived in the modest house where he grew up, Mom's smile became particularly bright, the kind of brightness that appeared when she encountered information she could weaponize later. How refreshing that David values simplicity, she said, her tone carefully neutral. So many young professionals today are obsessed with material success. Of course, that perspective can change when real responsibilities develop. Mortgage payments, insurance premiums, planning for children's education expenses. The conversation continued in this vein throughout the evening, with every topic becoming an opportunity to highlight the vast differences between David's modest background and the lifestyle I had grown up taking for granted. My parents didn't openly criticize David or his choices, but they systematically emphasized every area where his resources, connections, or ambitions fell short of their expectations. When David described his commitment to sustainable construction practices, Dad positioned it as admirable idealism that might need to be tempered by practical business considerations. When David mentioned his volunteer work with Habitat for Humanity, Mom praised his community spirit, while noting how such activities could become time-consuming distractions from building a successful practice. The most devastating moment came during dessert, when Dad launched into what appeared to be a friendly discussion about wedding planning. Of course, we're thrilled to provide whatever Natalie needs for her special day, he said, his voice warm with paternal generosity. The venue, the catering, the flowers, we want everything to be perfect for our daughter. Then came the subtle knife thrust. We've been setting aside funds for this celebration since Natalie was 16. It's quite substantial now, enough to ensure that she can have the kind of wedding that reflects her upbringing and our family's position in the community. David's response was gracious but revealed everything my parents needed to know. That's incredibly generous, he said. Natalie and I were actually thinking about something smaller and more intimate, but we appreciate your support for whatever we decide together. The phrase, whatever we decide together, hung in the air like a declaration of war. Dad's jaw tightened, and Mom's fingers drummed once against her wine glass. Subtle tells that I recognized from years of observing their reactions to challenges to their authority. The ride home was conducted in loaded silence. My parents had learned that David was financially independent enough to be unimpressed by their wealth, principled enough to resist being bought, and confident enough to view himself as an equal partner in our relationship rather than a grateful recipient of family largesse. Over the following weeks, the opposition became more systematic and aggressive. Mom began forwarding me articles about successful young couples in Millbrook Springs, always featuring men who worked in finance, law, or established family businesses. The stories invariably emphasized the importance of compatible backgrounds and shared values in building lasting marriages. Dad started inviting potential suitors to business events where he knew I would be present. These men were invariably sons of business associates or family friends, young professionals with impressive credentials and substantial trust funds, who had been briefed about my availability and encouraged to pursue my attention. The psychological pressure was constant, but never direct enough to provoke an open confrontation. My parents positioned themselves as concerned advisors who only wanted me to consider all my options before making such an important decision. They never explicitly criticized David, but they consistently highlighted alternatives who could offer greater financial security, social status, and professional connections. The wedding fund became a particularly effective tool in this campaign. Regular updates about the account balance were accompanied by detailed descriptions of what the money could provide: exclusive venues, designer flowers, luxury honeymoon destinations, and professional photography that would create lasting memories of the perfect celebration. Each conversation about wedding expenses included gentle reminders about the fund's conditions and my parents' role as final arbiters of how the money could be spent. When I mentioned David's preference for a smaller ceremony, Mom expressed concern about wasting such a substantial investment on something that wouldn't properly showcase the significance of the occasion. The most insidious aspect of this pressure campaign was how it made me question my own judgment and desires. My parents were experts at presenting their preferences as objective wisdom, while making my choices appear selfish, impractical, or naive. They never said David was wrong for me, but they consistently implied that choosing him meant choosing struggle over security, uncertainty over stability, and personal satisfaction over family loyalty. Friends and extended family members were gradually recruited into the effort through carefully orchestrated conversations that positioned my parents as loving but worried about my future happiness. Cousins would mention how difficult it could be to maintain certain lifestyle standards on a modest income. Family friends would share stories about marriages that had struggled due to financial stress or incompatible social backgrounds. The constant undercurrent of disapproval began affecting my relationship with David in ways I didn't immediately recognize. I found myself defensive about his choices, apologetic about my family's behavior, and increasingly anxious about the growing conflict between the man I loved and the people who had shaped my entire worldview. David handled the pressure with remarkable patience and dignity, never responding to provocations or attempting to compete with my parents on their chosen battlefield of wealth and status. His refusal to engage in their games only frustrated them further, making them more determined to find leverage that could force him to retreat or reveal character flaws that would justify their opposition. The engagement period that should have been filled with joy and anticipation became a psychological endurance test, where every decision about our future was shadowed by the question of whether my parents would ultimately support or sabotage our marriage. I was about to discover just how far they were willing to go to maintain control over my life. Wedding planning became the battlefield where my parents' true intentions were finally revealed. What began as helpful suggestions and generous offers of assistance quickly transformed into a systematic takeover of every decision, designed to ensure that even my most personal celebration would serve their agenda, rather than reflect my actual desires. David and I had envisioned a simple ceremony at the Riverside Gardens, a charming outdoor venue overlooking the Millbrook River. We wanted something intimate and meaningful. Maybe 60 guests, wildflower arrangements, string lights creating a warm atmosphere, and a focus on celebrating our commitment rather than showcasing wealth. The venue rental was reasonable, the setting was naturally beautiful, and the relaxed atmosphere would allow our families and friends to actually connect with each other. Mom's reaction to our initial plans was swift and decisive. "The Riverside Gardens?" she repeated, her voice carefully controlled but her disapproval unmistakable. "Darling, that's where the Henderson girl had her wedding last summer. It was lovely for what it was, but hardly appropriate for a Holloway family celebration." Within 48 hours, she had scheduled appointments at 3 different venues that met her standards for appropriate settings. The Willowbrook Country Club, where Dad served on the board of directors. The Grand Ballroom at the Millbrook Springs Hotel, recently renovated to accommodate society weddings. The exclusive Fairmont Estate, available only to families who met certain membership criteria. Each venue tour became an education in the difference between what I wanted and what my parents deemed acceptable. The country club could accommodate 300 guests and featured a professional catering kitchen capable of serving elaborate multi-course meals. The hotel ballroom offered luxury amenities like crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and panoramic views of the city skyline. The estate provided complete privacy and exclusivity, ensuring that our celebration wouldn't be contaminated by the presence of anyone outside our social circle. When I protested that these venues were far too large and expensive for our intended celebration, Dad positioned the conversation as a teaching moment about family responsibility and social obligations. "Natalie," he said with patient condescension, "a wedding isn't just about the couple getting married. It's about honoring the relationships that made the celebration possible and acknowledging our position in the community." The guest list expansion began immediately. Our intimate gathering of 60 close friends and family members ballooned to over 200 as Mom systematically added business associates, country club members, charity committee colleagues, and social connections, who, quote, absolutely had to be included. Each addition was justified as essential for maintaining important relationships or avoiding potential offense to influential families. The Washingtons have invited us to every major celebration for the past decade, Mom explained as she added another table of guests I barely knew. Not including them would be incredibly rude and could damage your father's business relationships. The catering discussions revealed the true scope of my parents' vision for our celebration. Instead of the casual cocktail reception David and I had planned, Mom insisted on a formal sit-down dinner with multiple courses, wine pairings, and specialized dietary accommodations for guests with various preferences and restrictions. The menu selection process involved consultations with the country club's executive chef and tasting sessions that felt more like corporate board meetings than wedding planning. Every aspect of the celebration was subjected to similar transformation. Our preference for simple wildflower centerpieces was replaced with elaborate floral arrangements, featuring imported blooms and custom-designed containers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The string quartet we had booked was deemed insufficient for proper entertainment, leading to negotiations with a 12-piece orchestra capable of providing music for cocktails, dinner, and dancing. The dress shopping expedition became perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire planning process. I had fallen in love with a simple, elegant gown at a local boutique, understated but beautiful, comfortable enough for dancing, and reasonably priced. The dress reflected my personal style and felt authentic to who I was rather than who my parents wanted me to appear to be. Mom's reaction was immediate and decisive. "It's lovely, dear, but perhaps a bit too simple for such an important occasion. Let's explore some other options before making a final decision." The other options involved appointments at 3 different high-end bridal salons, each specializing in gowns that cost more than some people's cars. The sales associates had clearly been briefed about the Holloway family's expectations and budget, leading to presentations of increasingly elaborate dresses featuring hand-sewn beading, custom embroidery, and trains that required professional assistance to manage. After trying on 17 different gowns, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, wearing a heavily beaded creation that transformed me into someone I didn't recognize. The dress was undeniably stunning, but it felt like a costume designed for someone else's fantasy rather than an expression of my personal style. "Perfect," Mom declared, already reaching for her credit card before I could voice any reservations. "This is exactly what I envisioned for your special day." The photography package, the florist contracts, the catering agreements, every vendor selection followed the same pattern. My preferences were noted and politely dismissed in favor of options that met my parents' standards for appropriate quality and social impact. The wedding was becoming a showcase for the Holloway family's wealth and taste rather than a celebration of David's and my commitment to each other. David watched this transformation with growing concern but limited ability to intervene. His attempts to support my original vision were politely acknowledged and systematically overruled by references to the wedding fund and my parents' generous financial contribution to our celebration. "We just want everything to be perfect for Natalie," Mom would say whenever David questioned a particular decision. "We've been planning and saving for this day since she was a teenager." The implicit message was clear: whoever pays for the wedding controls the wedding, and any objections to their choices represented ingratitude for their generosity. The final venue selection meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon in Dad's office, with Mom presenting detailed comparisons of costs, amenities, and social implications for each location we had toured. The decision was framed as a family discussion, but the outcome had been predetermined before David and I arrived. The Willowbrook Country Club offers the best combination of elegance, convenience, and appropriate social setting, Dad announced, sliding the contract across his mahogany desk. "The membership will ensure that our guests feel comfortable, and the venue's reputation will reflect appropriately on both families." I signed the contract that afternoon, knowing that I was agreeing to much more than a wedding venue. I was accepting my parents' vision for my celebration, their control over my choices, and their authority to determine what was appropriate for my life. The wedding planning process had become a dress rehearsal for the marriage they expected me to have, one where their preferences would always take precedence over my personal desires. and where David's role would be to gratefully accept whatever arrangements they deemed suitable. What I didn't realize was that the venue contract was just the beginning of their plan, to ensure that my marriage would serve their interests rather than threaten their control over my future. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding, during what should have been a routine final planning meeting in Mom's office at Riverside Construction. I had arrived expecting to review last-minute details and confirm vendor arrangements, but instead found myself confronting the full extent of my parents' determination to control not just the wedding celebration, but the fundamental structure of my future marriage. The meeting began innocuously enough, with Mom spreading vendor contracts and timeline spreadsheets across her desk, while Dad reviewed the final guest count and seating arrangements. Everything appeared to be proceeding smoothly until I noticed an unfamiliar document among the wedding paperwork, a prenuptial agreement drafted by the family's attorney. "What is this?" I asked, lifting the document with trembling hands as I scanned the densely packed legal language. Mom's expression remained perfectly composed, as if she had been expecting this conversation for weeks. "It's simply a precautionary measure, darling. Standard practice for families with substantial assets who want to ensure everyone's interests are protected." The prenuptial agreement was far more comprehensive and invasive than anything I could have imagined. Beyond the typical financial protections, it included clauses governing where David and I could live, restrictions on career changes that might impact our earning potential, and provisions giving my parents veto power over major financial decisions during the first 5 years of marriage. Most shocking was a section outlining David's expected contributions to Riverside Construction, including mandatory consultation on any engineering projects that might benefit from his expertise and exclusive rights to his services for any sustainable construction initiatives the company might pursue. The agreement essentially treated our marriage as a business merger rather than a personal commitment between two people who loved each other. "This is insane," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "You're trying to control our entire marriage before it even begins." Dad's response was delivered in the patient tone he used when explaining complex business concepts to inexperienced employees. "Natalie, marriage is fundamentally a financial partnership. These agreements simply clarify expectations and prevent misunderstandings that could damage relationships later." "David will never sign this," I said, setting the document back on Mom's desk with enough force to scatter the other papers. "Then perhaps David isn't as committed to this marriage as he claims to be," Mom replied smoothly. "A man who truly loves you would want to provide these assurances to your family." The conversation that followed revealed the carefully constructed trap my parents had been building throughout the entire engagement period. The wedding fund, the elaborate venue, the expensive vendors, everything had been designed to create financial pressure that would force David to accept whatever conditions they imposed. "We've invested $60,000 in this celebration," Dad pointed out, his voice hardening. "The vendors require final payment within 2 weeks, and cancellation at this point would result in substantial penalties that would need to be covered somehow." The implicit threat was crystal clear: sign the prenuptial agreement or find a way to finance the wedding independently. They had systematically created a situation where the financial stakes were too high for David and me to walk away, then introduced conditions that would ensure their continued control over our marriage. When I called David that evening to explain the situation, his reaction was exactly what I had expected. "I'm not signing that document," he said firmly. "They're treating our marriage like a hostile corporate takeover." "I know," I replied, pacing around my apartment while considering our impossible options. "But if we don't agree to their terms, we'll have to cancel everything, or somehow find $60,000 in 2 weeks. David was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Maybe we should cancel. We could have a simple ceremony at the courthouse and use our savings for a small reception afterward. At least it would be honest." Part of me was tempted by his suggestion, but another part, the part that had been carefully conditioned by 27 years of family loyalty, recoiled from the idea of disappointing my parents so completely. The elaborate wedding represented more than just a celebration. It was proof of their love for me, evidence of their commitment to my happiness, and a symbol of everything they had worked to provide throughout my life. The next morning, I attempted to negotiate a compromise during another meeting in Dad's office. Perhaps we could modify some of the more invasive clauses in the prenuptial agreement, or establish a timeline for revisiting the terms after we had proven ourselves capable of managing our own affairs. "This isn't a business negotiation, Natalie," Dad said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "These protections exist for your benefit, whether you're mature enough to recognize that now or not." Mom's approach was more emotionally manipulative but equally inflexible. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," she said, reaching across the desk to touch my hand. "We simply want assurance that David understands the responsibilities that come with joining our family." The meeting ended with an ultimatum disguised as a reasonable deadline. I had 1 week to present the signed prenuptial agreement, or they would begin canceling vendor contracts and withdrawing financial support for the wedding. The choice was mine, they emphasized, but the consequences of choosing incorrectly would be entirely my responsibility to manage. That evening, David and I met at our favorite coffee shop in Cedar Falls to discuss our options away from the suffocating atmosphere of Millbrook Springs and my family's influence. The conversation was painful but necessary, forcing us to confront the reality that my parents viewed our marriage as a threat to be neutralized rather than a joy to be celebrated. "They're never going to accept me as an equal," David said, stirring his coffee absently while staring out the window. "No matter what I accomplish or how well I treat you, I'll always be the outsider who stole their daughter away from the life they planned for her." "So what do we do?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that our options were far more limited than I had initially believed. David was quiet for several minutes before responding. "We could sign the agreement temporarily, get married, and then work to renegotiate the terms once we're legally protected as a married couple." It was a pragmatic solution, but it felt like surrender. Agreeing to my parents' conditions would establish a precedent that would govern our entire marriage. Whenever they disapproved of our choices, they would simply threaten financial consequences until we complied with their wishes. The week that followed was the most miserable of my adult life. Every conversation with my parents included subtle reminders about the approaching deadline and gentle inquiries about David's willingness to be reasonable about protecting everyone's interests. Wedding vendors called daily with questions about final details, their cheerful professionalism, a stark contrast to the emotional warfare consuming my personal life. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake calculating financial scenarios and considering the long-term implications of every possible choice. Signing the prenuptial agreement would preserve the wedding and maintain family harmony, but at the cost of fundamental autonomy in my marriage. Refusing to sign would demonstrate independence and self-respect, but would require starting over completely with no financial support and substantial debt from cancellation penalties. 3 days before the deadline, I made my decision. I would call my parents' bluff and refuse to sign the agreement, accepting whatever consequences followed. David and I would find a way to manage the financial implications and create the kind of marriage we actually wanted, rather than the one my parents demanded. What I didn't anticipate was that my parents had one final card to play, one that would transform our wedding week from a celebration into a crisis that would test everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and unconditional love. Tuesday morning started like any other day in the final week before my wedding. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop to review the final vendor confirmations and payment schedules. David was handling the rehearsal dinner arrangements while I managed the last-minute details for the ceremony and reception. Everything seemed to be falling into place despite the ongoing tension with my parents over the prenuptial agreement. The first sign of trouble came when I logged into my online banking to transfer money for the final flower payment. The wedding fund account, which should have shown a balance of $62,000, displayed a shocking zero. I stared at the screen in disbelief, refreshing the page multiple times while my heart began racing with a mixture of confusion and growing panic. My hands trembled as I called the bank's customer service line, certain there had been some kind of technical error or fraudulent activity that could be quickly resolved. After 20 minutes of security questions and holds, the representative confirmed what I was desperately hoping wasn't true. Miss Holloway, the account was closed yesterday afternoon by the primary account holders, Benjamin and Patricia Holloway. All funds were transferred to a different account per their instructions. But that's impossible, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. That money was designated for my wedding expenses. They've been contributing to it for over 10 years. I understand your concern, the representative replied with professional sympathy. But as the primary account holders, they have full authority to manage the funds as they see fit. The account was closed following proper procedures. I hung up and immediately tried calling my parents, but both of their phones went straight to voicemail. Dad's office assistant said he was in meetings all day and couldn't be disturbed. Mom's secretary at the Charity Foundation gave me a similar response, though I detected something evasive in her tone that suggested she had been instructed to deflect my calls. By noon, I was sitting in the parking lot outside Riverside Construction, waiting for one of my parents to emerge so I could demand an explanation for what had to be a misunderstanding. When Dad finally appeared, walking toward his car with the casual confidence of someone who had just completed routine business, I intercepted him before he could drive away. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, standing directly in front of his Mercedes to prevent him from leaving. "The wedding fund account is empty. The bank said you closed it yesterday." His expression remained perfectly neutral, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of my wedding plans. "Let's continue this conversation in my office, where we can speak privately." The walk back into the building felt surreal. Employees who normally greeted me with friendly smiles seemed to avoid eye contact, suggesting that word of the family conflict had already begun circulating through the company. Dad's assistant offered coffee with unusual formality, treating me like a client rather than family member. Once his office door was closed, Dad settled behind his desk and regarded me with the calm authority he used during difficult business negotiations. "The wedding fund was established to support a celebration that would honor our family and reflect appropriate values," he began. "Given your refusal to sign reasonable protective agreements, we've concluded that the current wedding plans don't align with the fund's intended purpose." "You stole my wedding money," I said, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic discussion. $60,000 that was promised to me for over a decade. "We redirected resources away from an expenditure that would have been financially irresponsible," Dad corrected. "The money hasn't disappeared. It's been preserved for future use when you're prepared to make more mature decisions." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as parental concern. Dad explained that the wedding fund had always been contingent on their approval of my choices, though this condition had never been explicitly stated during the years of contributions and promises. He positioned the account closure as a protective measure designed to prevent me from making expensive mistakes during a period of emotional confusion. "David has obviously influenced your judgment in ways that aren't in your best interest," Dad continued. "We're simply ensuring that family resources aren't used to enable decisions you'll regret later." When I pointed out that vendor payments were due within days and that cancellation would result in substantial penalties, Dad's response revealed the calculated nature of their strategy. "Those concerns could be easily resolved if you're willing to have a reasonable conversation about the prenuptial agreement and your future plans." The implicit bargain was clear: sign their document and accept their control over my marriage, or watch my wedding collapse due to lack of funding. They had deliberately waited until the last possible moment to reveal their ultimatum, ensuring that I would have no time to secure alternative financing or make new arrangements. "Where's Mom?" I asked, realizing that this confrontation had been carefully choreographed to ensure maximum psychological impact. "Your mother is attending to other matters," Dad replied evasively, "but she shares my concerns about your recent choices and supports the decisions we've made." I left his office that afternoon with the devastating realization that my parents were willing to sabotage my wedding rather than accept my independence. The elaborate celebration they had insisted on planning, the vendors they had personally selected, the venue where they were members, everything would be canceled unless I capitulated to their demands for continued control over my adult life. The phone calls to vendors that evening were humiliating and heartbreaking. The florist, who had been designing arrangements for weeks, expressed sympathy, but explained that cancellation with less than a week's notice would still require payment of 75% of the contracted amount. The caterer had already ordered specialty ingredients and begun food preparation, making their cancellation fees equally devastating. David arrived at my apartment as I was calculating the financial damage on my laptop, surrounded by contracts and invoices that represented obligations we couldn't possibly meet independently. His reaction to the situation was immediate anger followed by protective determination. "We'll figure this out," he said, pulling up a chair beside me to review the numbers. "My savings, your emergency fund, credit cards if necessary, we'll find a way to cover the essential payments." But even combining all our available resources, we were short by almost $20,000. The wedding we had planned was financially impossible without my parents' support, and they had made their demands for that support absolutely clear. "Maybe we should just sign their agreement," I said quietly, hating myself for even considering surrender. "Get married first, then work on changing the terms later." David was quiet for a long moment before responding. "If we sign that document, we'll be setting a precedent for the rest of our marriage. Every time they disapprove of our choices, they'll find new ways to apply financial pressure until we comply." He was right, but the alternative seemed equally impossible. Canceling the wedding would disappoint hundreds of guests, waste thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits, and publicly humiliate both our families. Starting over with a simple ceremony would mean admitting that my parents had successfully forced us to abandon our original plans. As we sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by the wreckage of our wedding planning, I realized that my parents had crafted the perfect trap. They had systematically created a situation where every option involved significant sacrifice, and the path of least resistance led directly through their demands for continued control over my life. What I didn't yet understand was that their willingness to sabotage my wedding represented only the beginning of their campaign to ensure that my marriage would serve their interests rather than threaten their authority over my future. Wednesday morning arrived with the crushing weight of impossible decisions. I had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, cycling through scenarios that all led to the same devastating conclusion. My parents had successfully engineered a situation where my only choices were complete surrender or public humiliation. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, vendors were expecting final payments by Thursday, and I had no access to the funds that had been promised for over a decade. At 7 a.m., I drove to my parents' house on Magnolia Drive, determined to have one final conversation before everything collapsed completely. The house looked exactly as it always had. Perfectly manicured lawn, luxury cars in the circular driveway, and the imposing facade that had impressed countless business associates and social connections over the years. But now the familiar sight filled me with a mixture of grief and rage. Mom answered the door wearing her morning exercise outfit, her expression carefully neutral as if my unexpected visit was merely a minor inconvenience in her daily routine. "Natalie, dear, you look terrible. Are you sleeping enough? Wedding stress can be so overwhelming." The casual concern in her voice, delivered while she had deliberately sabotaged the very wedding she was referencing, nearly broke my composure completely. "We need to talk," I said, following her into the kitchen where she began preparing her usual protein smoothie with mechanical precision. "Of course," she replied, adding ingredients to the blender without looking at me. "Though I should mention that your father and I have a golf appointment at 9, so we'll need to keep this brief." The deliberate scheduling conflict was another calculated insult. They were treating the destruction of my wedding plans as less important than their recreational activities. I watched Mom measure protein powder and frozen berries while my entire future hung in the balance, and something fundamental shifted in my understanding of our relationship. "You stole my wedding fund," I said directly, abandoning any attempt at diplomatic conversation. Mom's hand paused briefly over the blender before she continued her preparations. "We redirected family resources away from supporting decisions that don't align with our values. The money hasn't disappeared. It's simply being held until you're ready to make more responsible choices." Responsible choices like signing a prenuptial agreement that gives you control over my marriage for the next 5 years? Protective measures that ensure your financial security and David's commitment to our family's well-being, she corrected, finally turning to face me. "These aren't unreasonable requests, Natalie. They're standard practices for families with substantial assets." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mom systematically deflecting my arguments while maintaining her position that their actions were motivated by love and concern for my future. Every attempt I made to explain how their ultimatum felt like betrayal was reframed as evidence of my emotional immaturity and David's negative influence on my judgment. When Dad appeared in the kitchen, dressed for golf and checking his watch impatiently, the dynamic shifted from manipulation to outright coercion. "Have you reached a decision about the agreement?" he asked without preamble. "I'm not signing it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I won't let you control my marriage the way you've controlled everything else in my life." Dad's expression hardened into the cold authority I remembered from childhood confrontations. "Then you'll need to find alternative funding for your celebration. We've already contacted the country club to discuss potential cancellation procedures." The casual mention of cancellation discussions revealed that they had been planning this scenario for weeks, possibly months. While I had been focused on flower arrangements and seating charts, they had been strategizing ways to ensure that my wedding would either serve their agenda or not happen at all. "You're my parents," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to remain strong. "You're supposed to support me, not sabotage the most important day of my life." "We are supporting you," Mom replied, her tone suggesting that I was too emotional to understand their perspective. "We're protecting you from making decisions that could damage your future security and happiness." That afternoon, I met David at the Riverside Gardens, the venue we had originally wanted before my parents redirected us toward the country club. We sat on a bench overlooking the water where we had first talked about getting married, and I finally accepted that our original vision had been right all along. "Let's cancel everything," I said, the words feeling both devastating and liberating. "Not postpone, cancel. We'll have a simple ceremony here with just our immediate families and closest friends." David studied my face carefully before responding. "Are you sure? This isn't just about the money anymore. This is about your relationship with your parents. There's no going back from this decision." "I know," I replied, surprised by how calm I felt once the choice was made. "But staying in this pattern means accepting that they'll always have veto power over my major life decisions. I can't build a marriage on that foundation." The next few hours were a whirlwind of difficult phone calls and financial calculations. The country club was surprisingly understanding about the cancellation, though their fees were substantial. The caterer was less accommodating, demanding full payment despite our inability to use their services. The florist agreed to scale down dramatically, but required immediate payment for the simplified arrangements. By evening, we had successfully canceled or modified most of the elaborate wedding plans, though the financial cost was devastating. Between cancellation fees, non-refundable deposits, and the scaled-down celebration we were planning for Saturday, we were facing debt that would take years to repay. But something unexpected had happened during this process of dismantling my parents' vision for our wedding. I felt more authentically myself than I had in months. Every decision we made together, from the simple flower arrangements to the casual reception menu, reflected our actual values rather than external expectations. When I called Jessica to explain the situation, her response was immediate and practical. "What do you need?" she asked without hesitation. "Money, vendors, help with setup. Whatever it takes." David's friends and family responded with similar generosity. offering everything from photography services to homemade desserts for the reception. My college roommate volunteered to coordinate the simplified event, while David's brother offered to officiate the ceremony using his recently acquired ordination credentials. Friday evening, as we finalized arrangements for our drastically simplified wedding, I realized that my parents' sabotage had inadvertently given us something we hadn't known we wanted: a celebration that was entirely our own creation, free from the weight of external expectations and social obligations. The guest list had shrunk from 200 to 35, but every person attending would be there because they genuinely supported our marriage rather than because they felt socially obligated to appear. The venue was modest but meaningful, the food would be simple but prepared with love, and the entire celebration would reflect our values rather than anyone else's vision of what our wedding should represent. Saturday morning arrived with a mixture of nervous excitement and profound relief. As I prepared for the ceremony in Jessica's apartment, rather than the luxury hotel suite my parents had originally booked, I felt more confident about my choices than I had in months. The woman looking back at me from the mirror was wearing a simple dress I had chosen myself, surrounded by friends who had supported my decision to prioritize authenticity over appearances, preparing to marry a man who valued partnership over patriarchal control. My parents would not be attending the ceremony. Their absence would be painful, but it would also be honest, a reflection of their choice to prioritize control over connection. As I prepared to walk down the aisle toward David and our future together, I realized that my parents' ultimate act of control had inadvertently become my first real act of independence. The weeks following our wedding were both exhilarating and exhausting. David and I had successfully created a beautiful ceremony that reflected our genuine values, but the financial aftermath of my parents' sabotage cast a shadow over what should have been our honeymoon period. We returned to our small apartment with substantial debt from cancellation fees, and the reality that our relationship with my family might be permanently damaged. I took a leave of absence from Riverside Construction immediately after the wedding, unable to face working alongside my parents while our personal relationship remained so fractured. The official reason was to focus on getting settled as newlyweds, but everyone understood the real motivation. The family business that had been my professional home for 3 years suddenly felt hostile and unwelcoming. David threw himself into his engineering practice, taking on additional consulting projects to help offset our unexpected wedding expenses. I found temporary work as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization, using skills I had developed at Riverside Construction, but in an environment free from family politics and emotional manipulation. The isolation from my parents was initially painful but gradually became liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions without considering their potential reactions or seeking their approval. David and I established our own routines, decorated our apartment according to our preferences, and began building the kind of partnership I had never seen modeled in my family home. But financial stress remained a constant presence in our daily lives. The combined debt from wedding cancellations and our scaled-down celebration totaled nearly $18,000, spread across multiple credit cards with varying interest rates. Every month brought minimum payment obligations that strained our modest combined income and limited our ability to save for future goals. 3 months after the wedding, while organizing paperwork in our bedroom closet, I discovered a folder of documents I had brought from my childhood bedroom but never thoroughly examined. Most of the contents were routine, old-school transcripts, medical records, and insurance policies from when I was covered under my parents' plans. But tucked between my college diploma and some tax documents was something that made my heart race with possibilities I had never considered. The papers were related to a trust fund established by my maternal grandmother, Eleanor Fairchild, shortly before her death when I was 15. I had vague memories of family discussions about Grandma Eleanor's will and her desire to ensure her grandchildren's educational and professional independence, but the details had always been managed entirely by my parents. According to the documentation, the Eleanor Fairchild Education Trust had been funded with an initial deposit of $100,000, invested conservatively and intended to support my educational expenses and early career development. The trust was structured to provide me with full access to the funds upon reaching age 25, which had occurred over 2 years ago. More intriguingly, the papers indicated that I was listed not just as the beneficiary but as co-trustee alongside my parents, giving me legal authority to review all trust activity and make decisions about fund management. This was clearly not something my parents had wanted me to discover, given that they had never mentioned my co-trustee status or provided any documentation about the trust's performance. I spent that evening reading and rereading the legal documents, trying to understand the implications of what I had found. The trust was substantial enough to eliminate our wedding debt and provide significant financial independence, but my parents had maintained complete control over the funds by never informing me of my legal rights as co-trustee. The next morning, I called Taylor Morrison, a college friend who had become a financial advisor specializing in family trusts and estate planning. After explaining the situation and emailing her scanned copies of the documents, she called back within hours with information that transformed my understanding of our financial situation. "This is fascinating," Taylor said, her voice mixing professional interest with personal outrage on my behalf. "You've been legally entitled to full information about this trust for over 2 years, including detailed statements about investments, distributions, and any transfers that have been made." "What kind of transfers?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "Well, that's what we need to investigate. As co-trustee, you have the right to request complete financial records, going back to the trust's establishment. You're also authorized to place administrative holds on any distributions if you suspect improper management." Taylor explained that trust funds were often used as financial management tools by controlling families, with beneficiaries kept deliberately uninformed about their rights and resources. The fact that my parents had never mentioned my co-trustee status suggested they were either unaware of the provision themselves or had chosen to conceal it for their own purposes. "The interesting thing about co-trustee arrangements," Taylor continued, "is that they typically extend to any accounts that are directly funded by or connected to the original trust. If your parents have been moving money from the trust into their personal accounts or business investments, you may have legal authority over those funds as well." That afternoon, I began the process of requesting complete trust documentation from the financial institution that managed the account. The bank required extensive identity verification and legal documentation, but within a week, I had access to 12 years of trust activity that revealed a pattern of financial management that bordered on misappropriation. The trust had grown substantially through conservative investments, reaching a current value of nearly $160,000. But the records showed systematic transfers to accounts belonging to my parents, always maintaining enough balance in the trust to avoid triggering automatic oversight, but consistently moving excess funds into investments that benefited their personal financial portfolio. Most damaging was the revelation that substantial portions of Riverside Construction's expansion funding had come from trust transfers, with my parents essentially using my inheritance to finance their business growth. The transfers were technically legal under the broad investment authority granted to trustees, but they represented a clear conflict of interest and pattern of self-dealing. Taylor's analysis of the financial records was even more revealing. "Your parents have been treating this trust like their personal investment account," she explained during our follow-up meeting. "They've moved money into business investments, real estate purchases, and even some personal expenses that were categorized as educational or professional development costs." "Can they do that legally?" I asked, though the answer was becoming clear. "Some of it, yes. Trustees have broad discretionary authority. But as co-trustee, you have equal authority to question their decisions and place administrative holds on accounts if you believe the funds aren't being managed in your best interest." The most shocking discovery came when Taylor cross-referenced the trust transfers with public records about Riverside Construction's corporate accounts. My parents had been using trust funds to capitalize major business investments, then listing those investments as assets that secured their personal retirement accounts and business credit lines. "This is where it gets interesting," Taylor said, highlighting specific transactions on her computer screen. "If trust funds were used to secure or capitalize accounts that your parents consider their personal assets, you may have co-trustee authority over those accounts as well." The legal framework was complex, but the basic principle was straightforward. If my inheritance had been used to fund or secure other accounts, I had legal standing to exercise oversight authority over those accounts until the original trust funds were properly segregated and managed. For the first time since my parents had sabotaged our wedding, I felt a sense of possibility rather than powerlessness. The financial leverage that had allowed them to control my choices could potentially be turned back on them, forcing them to acknowledge my adult autonomy and respect my independence. But using this information would require crossing a line that felt both necessary and terrifying. Taking action against my parents' financial interests would likely destroy any remaining possibility of reconciliation, but continuing to accept their manipulation would mean never achieving genuine independence. As I sat in Taylor's office that afternoon reviewing legal documents that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in my family relationships, I realized that my parents' decision to steal my wedding fund had inadvertently led me to discover resources and rights they had concealed for years. The question now was whether I had the courage to use those resources to protect my marriage and establish the independence they had spent decades trying to prevent. The decision to take action against my parents felt simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. For 3 sleepless nights, I wrestled with the moral implications of using their own tactics against them, while David provided patient support, without trying to influence my choice. He understood that this decision had to be entirely mine, free from any external pressure that might later become a source of regret or resentment. On Thursday morning, I called Taylor and authorized her to initiate a formal review of the Eleanor Fairchild Education Trust, citing concerns about potential mismanagement and conflicts of interest in the trustees' investment decisions. The legal language was deliberately neutral, but we both understood that this action would trigger automatic administrative holds on any accounts directly connected to or funded by the original trust. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Taylor asked before submitting the paperwork. "Once we file this review request, there's no taking it back quietly. Your parents will be notified within 24 hours, and they'll understand immediately that you've discovered information they preferred to keep hidden." "I'm sure," I replied, surprised by how calm I felt once the decision was made. They used financial manipulation to try to control my marriage. It's time they experienced what that feels like from the other side. The administrative hold was processed by the bank that same afternoon. According to Taylor's explanation, the hold would prevent any transfers, withdrawals, or new investments from the affected accounts until the trust review was completed and any irregularities were resolved. For my parents, this meant their primary business account, several personal investment accounts, and their main retirement fund would be temporarily frozen. I knew the hold had taken effect when my phone began ringing at 6:30 Friday morning. Dad's calls started immediately, followed by increasingly frantic messages from Mom, then a series of texts that evolved from confused inquiries to barely controlled panic as they realized the scope of what had happened. I let every call go to voicemail, listening to their messages with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The first few were confused. "Natalie, there seems to be some kind of banking error affecting our accounts. Can you call us back when you have a moment?" By the fourth message, the tone had shifted to desperate. "The bank says you initiated some kind of investigation. We need to talk immediately." Saturday afternoon, while David and I were grocery shopping, my parents appeared at our apartment building. I spotted them through the lobby window as we returned from the store, Dad pacing by his Mercedes while Mom sat rigidly in the passenger seat, both looking more disheveled and anxious than I had ever seen them. "They look like they've aged 5 years in the past week," David observed as we watched them from the safety of the lobby. "Financial stress can be overwhelming," I replied, deliberately echoing Mom's dismissive comment about wedding planning stress from months earlier. When we finally went upstairs, my parents were waiting in the hallway outside our apartment door. Mom stood immediately when she saw us, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious desperation. Dad remained seated on the floor, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his typically perfect grooming showing signs of stress. "Natalie, thank God," Mom said, moving toward me before stopping when she saw my expression. "We've been trying to reach you for days. There's been some terrible mistake with the bank accounts." "There's no mistake," I replied, unlocking our apartment door but not inviting them inside. "I exercised my rights as co-trustee of Grandma Eleanor's trust fund." The color drained from Dad's face as he realized I had discovered not just the trust's existence, but my legal authority over accounts they had assumed I would never access. "You don't understand the implications of what you've done," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "You used my inheritance to capitalize your business investments, then used those investments to secure your retirement accounts. As co-trustee, I have legal authority over any accounts connected to the original trust funds." The conversation that followed took place in our apartment's small living room, with my parents sitting stiffly on our second-hand couch while David and I remained standing. The power dynamic was completely reversed from every previous family confrontation, and the difference was striking. Mom attempted to explain their financial decisions as protective measures designed to grow my inheritance through strategic investments, but her justifications sounded hollow when delivered from a position of financial vulnerability rather than authority. Dad tried to reframe the trust transfers as sophisticated wealth management that had benefited everyone involved, but his arguments were undermined by his obvious panic about the account holds. "The trust has actually performed very well under our management," Dad said, pulling out his phone to show financial projections. "Your inheritance has grown by nearly 60% over the past 12 years. While you used the principal to fund business investments that I never authorized," I replied. "And while you hid my co-trustee status to prevent me from having any oversight of my own money." The most devastating moment came when I presented them with Taylor's analysis of their financial activity, including documentation of how trust funds had been systematically transferred to accounts that supported their personal wealth accumulation. The evidence was irrefutable, and their attempts to justify their actions became increasingly desperate. "We can resolve this immediately," Mom said, reaching into her purse for her checkbook. "We'll transfer funds back to the trust account to cover any amounts you feel were improperly managed." "This isn't about money anymore," I replied. "This is about the pattern of control and manipulation that you've used throughout my entire adult life." David, who had remained silent during most of the conversation, finally spoke. "You stole Natalie's wedding fund to force her to sign a prenuptial agreement that would have given you control over our marriage. Then you acted surprised when she discovered that you'd been controlling her inheritance for over a decade." The accusation hung in the air while my parents struggled to respond. They couldn't deny the timeline of events or the connection between their wedding sabotage and my discovery of the trust irregularities. "What do you want?" Dad finally asked, his business negotiation instincts taking over despite his weakened position. "I want the same thing I've always wanted," I replied. "Independence. Respect for my choices, and acknowledgement that I'm an adult capable of managing my own life and marriage." The negotiation that followed was unlike any conversation I had ever had with my parents. For the first time in my life, they were asking for my cooperation rather than demanding my compliance. The administrative hold on their accounts had created financial pressure that made them willing to consider terms they would never have accepted from a position of strength. The agreement we reached was straightforward. They would transfer the full current value of the trust to an account under my sole control, formally acknowledge my independence in written documentation, and cease any attempts to influence or control my marriage. In exchange, I would lift the administrative hold on their business and retirement accounts. "And the prenuptial agreement?" Mom asked as we finalized the terms. "Is completely off the table," I replied. "David and I will manage our marriage without your oversight or interference." Dad signed the agreement that evening, his signature looking smaller and less confident than usual. Mom added her signature with obvious reluctance, but the financial pressure had made resistance impossible. As they prepared to leave our apartment, Mom paused at the door. "We really did think we were protecting you," she said quietly. "I know," I replied, and for the first time in months I felt genuine sympathy for them. But protection that requires control isn't love, it's fear. The administrative hold was lifted Monday morning, restoring their access to the frozen accounts. By Tuesday afternoon, the trust funds had been transferred to my personal account, finally giving me the financial independence that should have been mine years earlier. For the first time since our wedding, David and I could plan our future without the shadow of debt or the threat of financial manipulation. My parents had inadvertently given me something they never intended: the resources and confidence to build the independent life they had spent decades trying to prevent. 6 months have passed since that tense afternoon in our apartment, when my parents signed away their financial control over my life, and the transformation has been more profound than I could have imagined. David and I used the trust funds to eliminate our wedding debt, establish an emergency savings account, and make a down payment on a modest house in Cedar Falls, far enough from Millbrook Springs to feel independent, but close enough for David's engineering practice to maintain its client relationships. Our new home is everything my parents' house wasn't: comfortable rather than impressive, functional rather than performative, and filled with furniture we chose together based on our actual needs rather than social expectations. The mortgage payment is manageable on our combined income, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm building financial security that no one can take away. The professional changes have been equally liberating. I left the nonprofit bookkeeping position and joined a small business consulting firm that specializes in helping family-owned companies improve their operational efficiency. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now using skills learned at Riverside Construction to help other business owners create healthier workplace dynamics and more transparent financial practices. David's engineering firm has grown substantially, partly due to his association with sustainable construction projects that are increasingly popular in our region. He's hired 2 additional consultants and moved into a larger office space, building the kind of principled business that reflects his values rather than compromising them for financial gain. The most unexpected development has been the gradual restoration of communication with my parents. The process began 3 months ago when Mom called to inform me that Dad had suffered a minor heart attack. Not life-threatening, but serious enough to require hospitalization and lifestyle changes. Despite everything that had happened between us, I drove to Millbrook Springs immediately to offer support during his recovery. The conversation we had in Dad's hospital room was unlike any discussion we'd ever shared. The medical crisis had stripped away his usual need to control every situation, leaving him vulnerable and reflective in ways I'd never witnessed. For the first time, he acknowledged that his approach to parenting had been motivated more by fear than wisdom. "I built Riverside Construction from nothing," he said, looking older and frailer than I'd ever seen him. "I wanted to ensure that you would never experience the financial insecurity I grew up with. But somewhere along the way, I confused security with control." Mom's perspective had evolved as well, though her changes were more gradual and less dramatic than Dad's medical wake-up call. She had continued her work with various charitable organizations, but I noticed that her approach had shifted toward supporting causes that promoted family counseling and healthy relationship dynamics. "Watching you build your marriage with David has been educational," she admitted during one of our tentative coffee meetings. "You've created something authentic that I'm not sure your father and I ever achieved. The relationship we're rebuilding is fundamentally different from what existed before. Our interactions are more honest but less frequent, more respectful but less intimate. They ask about our lives without trying to manage our choices, and I share information without feeling like I'm providing ammunition for future manipulation." David has been remarkably generous about including my parents in our lives despite their previous treatment of him. His Christmas dinner invitation was gracious and genuine, though he made it clear that our home operates according to our values rather than external expectations. The evening was somewhat stilted but peaceful, marking the first time all four of us had shared a meal since our wedding sabotage. The financial independence has proven to be as psychologically transformative as it is practically beneficial. Knowing that I can support myself without family assistance has fundamentally altered how I approach every decision, from career choices to vacation planning to future family planning. The safety net that my parents provided through financial dependency has been replaced by the more substantial security of personal competence and genuine partnership. David and I have started discussing the possibility of starting our own family, conversations that would have been impossible under the shadow of my parents' financial control. We talk about the kind of parents we want to be: supportive without being controlling, protective without being limiting, loving without demanding gratitude for basic respect. The trust fund discovery taught me that financial transparency is essential for healthy family relationships. We've already established education accounts for our future children, but with built-in provisions ensuring they'll have full information about their resources and rights when they reach adulthood. No child of ours will discover at 27 that they've been kept ignorant of their own financial capabilities. My work with family business consulting has provided insights into how common our family dynamic actually was. Many successful entrepreneurs struggle with transitioning from protective parents to respectful advisors, and many adult children accept financial dependency rather than pursuing the difficult work of establishing independence. The patterns that felt so personal and unique to my family are actually widespread issues that affect countless families where money becomes confused with love. Jessica remains one of my closest friends and frequently observes how much more confident and authentic I've become since establishing financial independence. "You used to ask permission for everything," she pointed out during our recent lunch. "Now you make decisions and inform people about them afterward." The difference is subtle but profound. I no longer calculate how my choices might affect other people's willingness to support me financially, because I no longer need that support. The mental energy that was previously devoted to managing family expectations is now available for pursuing genuine interests and building meaningful relationships. Looking back on the wedding fund theft that initially felt so devastating, I can see it as the catalyst that forced me to discover resources and capabilities I never knew I possessed. My parents' attempt to control my marriage through financial manipulation inadvertently led me to the very independence they had spent decades trying to prevent. The irony is that our relationship is actually healthier now that it's based on choice rather than obligation. When I visit Millbrook Springs or invite my parents to our home, it's because I genuinely want to maintain family connections, not because I'm financially dependent on their approval. David and I celebrated our first wedding anniversary with a small dinner party in our new home, surrounded by friends who had supported us through the crisis and family members who had learned to respect our autonomy. The celebration was modest but meaningful, reflecting the kind of authentic relationships we've prioritized over impressive appearances. As I write this, sitting in the home office of the house we own together, I feel profoundly grateful for the journey that brought us to this point. The path from financial dependency to independence was painful and complicated, but it led to something more valuable than money: the confidence to build a life based on our values rather than external expectations. If you've ever struggled with controlling family members or financial manipulation, I want you to know that independence is possible, even when it feels impossible. Sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones who have the hardest time letting us become who we're meant to be. But on the other side of that struggle is the freedom to build authentic relationships, pursue meaningful work, and create the kind of life that reflects your actual values rather than inherited expectations. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it encourages anyone who needs to hear that financial independence and family relationships don't have to be mutually exclusive, but sometimes you have to fight for both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.